So I'm here to talk about the marathon and running, and I'm delighted to see that some of you are planning to run. How many of you are thinking about maybe running in the future at some point? Okay, good. How many of you, there's no way you'd ever want to run a marathon at all in your entire lives? Actually, that's the smallest number of hands that have gone up. That's good. And I'm guessing a lot of people didn't raise their hands to any of those questions, which is fine. Anyway, so I would like to start by thinking about the kind of world that we live in. And just to remind us that the 21st century, if you just watch the news, you realize what a strange world it is today. But as somebody who studies the evolution of the body, I'd like to remind us all that the way in which we use our bodies today is really profoundly abnormal from an evolutionary perspective. So the average American, for example, today watches about 5 hours of TV. Okay, we all watch that, right? Yeah, exactly. The average American is about 23 pounds overweight. The average American throws out about a half a pound of food every single day, which is an extraordinary amount of food. The average American walks less than 3 miles a day, which is actually about what a chimpanzee walks, by the way. The average American wears shoes. I can see everybody here is wearing shoes, myself included, right? We eat breakfast from a box, which if you think about it is a really strange thing. And the average American, believe it or not, drives 33 miles a day, about 50 kilometers a day. It's an extraordinary amount. That's the national average. And so these are all, from an evolutionary perspective, extraordinarily weird things. And yet, the average American also thinks that what the people are going to be doing on Sunday is also a weird thing, right? Getting out there, starting on the Embarcadero and running 26.2 miles. I gather there are about 26,000 runners this year in total in the marathon. I guess not all of them are running the marathon. Some of them are running the half marathon. And the average runner is going to burn about 2,800 calories. I don't think any of us in this room have a chance of winning. Maybe I'm misjudging the physiques of the people in the room, but certainly I have no chance of winning. And there's going to be a lot of pain and suffering and misery, right? There's going to be blisters and bleeding nipples and shin splints and leg cramps and all kinds of broken toenails. There's going to be a lot of misery out there on the course, though a lot of very happy people when they finish. And people think that this is a very strange thing to do. And one of the questions is, why? Why do people do this, right? Why? A lot of people sit in their armchairs or stand along the side of the road in the marathon or just think about it and wonder, why are people doing this, right? Well, there's a lot of other interesting why questions. For example, it turns out about 1 million people run a marathon a year. Why do so many people run a marathon? Marathon running turns out to be one of the largest charitable activities on the planet today. Do you know the single biggest charity in the world that happens on a single day is the London Marathon. Raises about $75 million every year, this London Marathon. The New York Marathon raises like $25 to $30 million a year, the Boston Marathon, et cetera. The big city marathons are huge. So runners raise hundreds of millions of dollars in charity. And by the way, a bunch of us are raising money for the Leakey Foundation this year. Not hundreds of millions of dollars, sadly, but runners do all kinds of other strange things. Like, for example, those of you running, I guarantee you that you're probably smearing your body with Vaseline and various other sorts of things. And then finally, if you go out and watch the marathon, people will be doing all kinds of strange stuff. They'll be wearing weird clothes, and they won't be, how many of you like to have dogs, right? None of you have dogs? Not a single person in this room has a pet dog? Okay, just a few. I guess we're in a very urban environment. Well, I have a dog, but people don't bring their dogs on marathons. How come we don't bring our dogs on marathons? So to answer these questions, and there are many more, we can come up with lots of other questions about the marathon. There's sort of two levels to think about them, and one are proximate explanations. Those are the mechanistic sort of how questions, right? So one proximate explanation for why people might run a marathon is that, well, they got inspired by that Robert Browning poem, and they want to be like Pheidippides. By the way, you know the story of Pheidippides and how, it was the Battle of Marathon, and he ran from Marathon to Athens, and then back, and his army supposedly died. Actually, Pheidippides, there's no evidence that Pheidippides died. It was made up by Browning to make it seem very romantic. So when people say, oh yeah, I wouldn't run a marathon because after all, Pheidippides died, you can tell them that that's a Victorian invention by Browning. But anyway, that's another story. So one explanation is they want to be like Pheidippides, it's romantic, et cetera. Another is that there are a lot of people out there who are overweight or unhealthy, et cetera, and their doctor tells them that if they don't start exercising, they're going to die. And they're type A personalities, so they invest into exercise, just what they did to invest in their careers or whatever that got them into that physical state in the first place. And then finally, there's a lot of people, an incredible number of people, who run marathons because they had a bet. And I'm not sure quite what the percentage is, but it's actually a very high number. But those are all proximate explanations for why people run long distances. What's important about evolutionary theory is that evolutionary theory helps us address much larger ultimate questions, the why questions. And there's a very famous expression by Theodosius Dobzhansky. That's this guy over here. That's, of course, Darwin. Darwin never said this. But Dobzhansky wrote a very famous essay, actually for high school teachers, entitled "Nothing in Biology Makes Sense Except in the Light of Evolution." And that's, of course, because our bodies weren't engineered, they weren't designed, they evolved. And to understand why we are the way we are, we need to understand the evolutionary story behind that. And so I'd like to talk today about the why we run. And for me, this journey started many, many years ago when we were studying how pigs stabilize their heads, or actually how humans stabilize their head while running. And we started doing some experiments on pigs, and it led to a long series of experiments. And ultimately, in 2004, a colleague of mine, Dennis Bramble, and I published this paper in the journal Nature entitled Born to Run. And our argument was that humans evolved to run long distances maybe about 2 million years ago in order to hunt and to scavenge. And that our ability to run distances like the marathon, our ability to go out and run 5 miles, 10 miles, et cetera, is actually quite an extraordinary talent that as a result of natural selection, and that it's helped make us who we are. It's not all that made us who we are, but it's a part of that story. And to tell that story, since I'm told that this is kind of a cool crowd and I shouldn't give too nerdy a talk, I want to do a kind of a thought experiment. So let's imagine it's 2 million years ago, and we're all completely naked Homo erectuses, okay? And maybe that's not a fantasy you want to have, but anyway, so imagine it's 2 million years ago, you're somewhere in Africa, and it's kind of hot and dry, and you're hungry. And imagine, for example, that you're a female Homo erectus. So females, for most of human evolutionary history, were either pregnant or nursing. And nursing takes much more time. So a typical nursing female Homo erectus, we can estimate, would have needed about 2,500 calories per day in order to pay for her needs, plus the cost of producing milk. But she's also probably got some kids in tow, right? She's probably taking care of a toddler or and some other infant. So she needs actually more energy. So she needs a lot of energy, well more than 2,500 calories a day, to pay for her basic energetic needs, plus the needs of her offspring. That's a lot of energy, right? Where do you get that kind of food? Because they're living in habitats like this, right? If you look out here in this sort of typical African savanna scene, what is there to eat? Right. It's the zebra, right? So we know that starting around, well, the oldest evidence that's sort of secure is around 2.6 million years ago. Of course, probably started a little bit earlier than that. But by at least 2.6 million years ago, we have really incontrovertible evidence that humans, our early humans, our ancestors, Homo erectus, or the ancestors of Homo erectus, are eating meat. They're making stone tools. Here, for example, is a bone that's been cut open. The marrow has been extracted. There are cut marks on it. They're eating animals, right? And that raises a really interesting question, right? So imagine you're going to try to get one of those zebras. The problem is we have none of the natural adaptations that other carnivores have to get these animals, right? Usain Bolt is the fastest guy on the planet at the moment, right? He can run 10.4 meters a second for about 10 seconds. He can run a little bit slower for 20 seconds. He can't run at that speed for much longer than 20 or 30 seconds. He completely runs out of gas. The average, so he's the fastest guy on the planet. The average quadruped out in the savannah can run about 20 meters a second, so twice as fast as Usain Bolt for about 4 minutes. Usain Bolt would have no chance of catching any of these animals out there on the savannah, right? And probably, this early Homo erectus didn't have the fancy training and the shoes and all the other, the goo and the steroids and whatever that help. I'm not saying that Usain Bolt takes steroids. The Russians, another story. But anyway, okay. So Usain Bolt is not fast enough to catch these animals. The other thing is that humans lack any of the natural weapons of carnivores. We don't have claws, we don't have fangs, we don't have all that fur to protect us. Because of course, to be a carnivore, not only do you have to be mean and nasty when you try to kill something, but you also have to deal with the other carnivores who try to kill you. And we didn't have also any technology. We often think about when we hunt, we use technology. But the bow and arrow was invented less than 100,000 years ago. The spear thrower, way less than that, maybe 20,000 years ago. Just putting a sharpened point on the end of a stick, the oldest points that we have in the archaeological record are about 500,000 years old. So for millions of years, for maybe 2 million years, the most lethal weapons available to our ancestors were pointed sticks. And I can guarantee you, if any of you go on safari, don't just take a pointed stick and go to try to kill the wildebeest. It's not going to work. The only way to kill it is you have to get up close and personal to the wildebeest, which of course makes you very much at danger of being, well, I mean, I just can't imagine people hunted that way. This would be, you're much better off being a vegetarian than trying to do that. This is a serious fitness reducing event. The people who make these illustrations, they look great. They're complete, utter fantasy. Nobody hunts like that. That's really dangerous. Okay. So how did we do it? And our hypothesis is that for millions of years, before the invention of technology, before all the things that we, Star Market or Whole Foods or whatever it is you shop out here, what we did was endurance running. And we have evidence from skeletons. So this is a very famous skeleton of a Homo erectus that's 1.6 million years old. It's a beautiful skeleton. But we have other bits and pieces. But there's a beautiful, fairly large skeleton. And I'm not going to go into all these details, but we have evidence from the fossil record for all kinds of features that we see in the fossil record, some of which would have made the species really good at walking long distances. But a lot of these features have no relevance to walking whatsoever biomechanically. And they're adaptations for running. And that's really another lecture. And I'm not going to go into those features. And so we can make the hypothesis that we started running about 2 million years ago. And here's how it works. So we are able to run distances, long distances at speed that make other animals have to gallop. So to show you this is speed on the x-axis. And I've plotted it in the nerdy scientific way of meters per second. But here I just put as a marker here, I put for 6 meters per second is 21 kilometers an hour or 4.5 minutes per mile. And I've plotted here the human endurance running range. So this is the speed up to which humans can run a marathon. So the fastest runners on Sunday will be running pretty much close to here. Most of us will be running, over in this speed range here. And here I've got the trot-gallop transition for dogs, ponies, and horses. And by the way, I've got really big dogs. I've got dogs the size of humans. These are greyhounds, right? And the important point is, of course, these animals can go way faster than humans, right? Usain Bolt's here at 10.4 meters per second, the fastest human on the planet. But the important point is that although all of these animals can run way faster than any of us can run, we can run marathons at distances that are above the trot-gallop transition of all these animals. And trotting is the endurance gait of quadrupeds. Quadrupeds cannot gallop long distances. They break down, they overheat. There's all kinds of problems that they encounter. So even I'm a middle-aged professor, right? I'm obviously not going to win anything ever in my entire life. I have never won anything in my entire life. But I can run faster than a dog can run at a trot. So I can run above the trot-gallop transition speed. I can run a marathon above the trot-gallop transition speed of a greyhound. I can actually run like a half marathon above the trot-gallop transition speed of a pony. And again, I'm never going to win any race in my life. I'm not a great runner. And any decent runner can easily run above not only the trot-gallop transition speed of ponies, they can actually run above the trot-gallop transition speed of full-size horses for marathon distances. So, and why is that important? Well, because when humans run, we cool by sweating. So this lady at the Westminster Dog Show, looking rather elegant, if you ask me, right? She is running with her, I don't know, that's a very scary looking wolf hound or something. I don't know. Anyway, she's of course burning a lot of fuel and she's generating a lot of heat, but she's sweating. This animal can't sweat. It doesn't have any sweat glands. It's cooling by panting. Short, shallow breaths, which cause evaporation in the oral tract, which cause heat loss, and that cools the blood in the oral tract, which cools the body. Now, the cool thing about quadrupeds, or the uncool thing about quadrupeds, if you're a quadruped, is that when you're galloping, you can't pant. Because a gallop is a seesaw gait. And actually, really interesting experiments that were done when I was a graduate student in the lab next to me when I was at Harvard showed that as quadrupeds gallop, because of that seesaw gait, right, their guts slam at the same frequency as their stride frequency and slam into the diaphragm, so they can't actually have these short little shallow breaths in between their normal breathing. So they have to train their breathing to their stride frequency as soon as they start galloping. And if you don't believe me, take your family dog for a run, and you'll notice that the dog will be panting. Well, it's so cool here, they probably won't have to pant that much. But on a hot day, your dog will pant, right? And if you run fast and you make your dog gallop, the dog won't be able to pant. And when it wants to cool down, it'll do all kinds of devious things like my dog does. It'll wrap itself around your legs or just have all these needs to pee, et cetera. That enables the animal to pant and to cool down. So if you combine the fact that we can run long distances that make animals gallop and that animals can't cool down when they gallop, that gives us a huge advantage. And that advantage is manifested in a kind of hunting called persistence hunting. People still do this today. Very rarely, though. But what you do is, on a really hot day, the hotter the better, you pick an animal, and you pick the biggest animal as you can, because bigger things get hot faster, just like bigger humans get hot faster. And you chase the animal, and you try to chase it above its trot-gallop transition speed. So you make it run away, and of course it starts heating up. Now it's going to run faster than you can chase it, and it's going to go hide in the bushes, and then you track it. And of course, you track it at a walk. And then you chase it again. And if you can get to it before it's cooled down and chase it again, and you've kind of a walking, running, chasing, tracking kind of combination, you can eventually drive that animal into a state of hyperthermia, heat stroke, and you can walk right up to it, and you can kill it without any technology. This guy's using a spear, but in some parts of the world, like, for example, the Tarahumara, where I've been doing research recently, they traditionally just use a rock. They don't bother bringing a spear. They just, because you don't need any technology to kill the animal at that point. It's dying already. It's defenseless. You can walk right up to it. It won't kick you. It won't gash you with its horns or anything like that. So it's actually not that difficult a thing to do. They're not running that fast. They're actually running at a very leisurely kind of 10-minute mile pace, generally. They're actually walking half the time. They're not running full marathon distances. They're running more like half marathons. It's not that challenging. The hardest thing about it is not the running. When you talk to these hunters, they always say the hardest thing about it is the tracking, trying to follow the animal's trails, trying to figure out where the animal is going. That's called persistence hunting. And we have ethnographic evidence that occurred all over the world. It was very common here in North America, here in India, in California, for example. There's lots of data from pretty much every Native American tribe was involved in persistence hunting. It also happened up all the way through Maine, like the Penobscot. It happened all the way through South America. We know it happens in Africa. We know it happens in Australia. We know it happened in the summer, even in places like Siberia. We have evidence that until recently, this was a very common way of hunting. And in fact, it's still described. Like, any of you read Robinson Crusoe, right? He actually runs down a goat on the island, if any of you know that book, through persistence hunting. So those of you who are running on Sunday, if you're kind of feeling a little bit tired, it's maybe, I don't know, halfway through the marathon, you're like, oh my God, how am I going to make it, right? And you're kind of feeling like just think about that animal that you're chasing. And of course, here in the San Francisco Marathon, they provided us with bison at the halfway point. I think it's very symbolic of the kinds of animals that we might have hunted. So unfortunately, I think we're not allowed to chase the bison, and it will not be good for your time in the marathon. So just think about chasing the bison, nothing more than that. So that raises a bunch of questions. And so one question is just how good are we at running, right? As I already told you before, Usain Bolt would have no chance in terms of beating any dog, or for that matter, most sheep or goat or whatever. Just how good are we? So we're obviously not very good at running fast, but what about distance, right? So it turns out that there are very few animals that run long distances, and they tend to be social carnivores. So hunting dogs, hyenas, horse will naturally run long distances. Horses will run long distances if you force them, if you put somebody on their back or whip them or something like that. And at a gallop, they can go about 20 kilometers. And dogs and horses can be, at a trot, be forced to do horribly long distances. They're actually very disturbing experiments that were done in the 1930s where they ran animals basically till their death to find out how far they could go. It's 1930s. Fortunately, nobody does that anymore. But humans, you know, a lot of people out there training for a marathon will easily run 10 to 15 kilometers a day, which is pretty much what social carnivores do. And on Sunday, 26,000 people here in this city are going to run 42 kilometers. And there are lots of people who like to run ultramarathons. So humans actually are able to run distances that match those of the world's best runners, the animal kingdom's very best runners. And remember, we're not carnivores, right? We're not quadrupeds. We're not horses. We're actually primates. And if you look at what other primates do, it's no contest. Chimpanzees will run about 100 meters, and that's about it. Paddis monkeys, the other. No, it's true. They're just like, if you watch a chimpanzee run after about 100 meters, it is a very unhappy chimpanzee. It's hot and sweaty and just looking miserable, and it just collapses. Paddis monkeys will run, but again, they won't run more than about 100 meters. So we are bizarre compared to other primates. We're quite remarkable. We're also capable of running in contexts that no other animal will run, right? So we not only run long distances, but we're also capable of running it in the heat. We have all these remarkable adaptations to run when it's really hot out there. And I can tell you the last few weeks in New England have been really, really hot. And we do that because we have special adaptations, right? We dump heat by breathing through our mouths. We have, of course, we sweat. We basically have sweat glands all over our bodies, and we've lost our fur. And you can lose a lot of heat by sweating. You lose 581 calories per milliliter. That's a huge amount of energy, or 581 kilocalories per liter. You're losing a huge amount of energy by sweating, which cools your body. And other animals that run long distances can't do it in the heat. So if you watch, for example, hyenas or hunting dogs or wolves or those Alaskan dogs, et cetera. I was in Greenland in March watching dogs. They only can do this kind of running when it's really cold. They cannot do it in the heat. So these animals run in Africa. They run either at night or at dawn or dusk. Wolves and sled dogs run in the winter. We can run. We're the only animal that can run in the heat. As I said before, just to remind you, we can run an incredible range of speeds. So humans can run well above the endurance speed of other animals. We're actually pretty efficient. When I was a student, there was a study which showed that humans were really inefficient runners. It turns out that study was based on one Italian who turned out to be not a very good runner. The study was redone, fortunately, and corrected for body mass. This is actually a graph of how much energy it takes to move per kilo per meter against body mass for a whole bunch of birds and mammals. This is the average line here for mammals. And you can see humans are just a little bit above the line, not any different from horses and various other animals that are really good at running. We're actually quite efficient at running. And finally, we're remarkable in terms of how long we can run really well. This is those of you who have ever run the Boston Marathon, anybody here run the Boston Marathon? Yay, okay. So then you know about Johnny Kelly. He was the great Boston runner. He ran every year for almost all his life, from when he was 22 years old up until he was in his 60s or 70s. And you can see that he won several times. By the way, he was the runner who lost the famous year that Heartbreak Hill got his name Heartbreak Hill, because his heart was broken by Tarzan Brown, who passed him. But you can see that his best time was 2:14, but he stayed within 20% of his peak time up until his 50s. That's remarkable. And he was still able to run sub-3-hour marathons up until he was 60 years old. So humans are not only able to run really fast, but we're able to run for a long period of time. If you go out into marathons, you'll see a lot of old people, elderly people. I shouldn't say old people, pardon me. I'm hoping to be one of those soon, who are able to run. I've seen 90-year-olds running marathons. And finally, to really put our money where our mouth is, every year there are races between humans and horses. The first one was started in Wales. You can imagine some drunk guys in a pub making a bet as to whether or not humans could beat a horse. And every year they've been running these man versus horse races in Wales. They're 25 miles. And to be honest, to be fair, most of the years the horses beat the men. But every time it's hot, the humans win. And by the way, these are not elite human runners. These are kind of, drunken Welshmen. A better race to look at actually is in Prescott, Arizona, where every year they have a man versus horse race. There's a 25-mile race, but a 50-mile race. In the 50-mile race, the humans almost always beat the horses. And again, it's only on very cool years that the horses have a chance of beating the humans. And by the way, the horses are required to have veterinary checkups because they're really worried about the horses. There are no doctor checkups for the humans. So humans actually can not only match, but often exceed the world's best runners, which are horses. So let's just explore finally this idea about how important human running is, because I think it helps explain a lot of really interesting things that we're going to see on Sunday. For example, one thing I've already explained is why we're not going to see any dogs, right? You will go out to the marathon on Sunday morning, you'll see lots and lots of humans, but nobody's bringing their dog. And I didn't see in the race information any prohibition about bringing your dog with you. There was no rule that no dogs allowed. But the reason for that is that it would be really bad for your dog. You would basically kill it, right? It would not be good for your dog. Unless it was really, really, really cold, and it's not going to be cold enough, your dog would overheat while you tried to run the marathon. Another interesting question is, when you go out and you see runners, occasionally, we do see runners all alone, but a lot of running is actually very social. Anybody who runs a lot knows that it's actually a very social thing. A lot of us run in groups. We find friends, and buddies, and et cetera, which we train in groups, and we run a lot together. And that this idea of the running as being a very solitary thing, I think, is extremely modern, and I would say a rather bizarre way of running. And I would argue that this is actually extremely ancient. Millions of years ago, when people went running and went to run down an animal, they would not run on their own. They would run in groups, because you would go in a group, you'd help each other. And of course, you need a number of individuals to bring that animal back. All the evidence we have for persistence hunting from every single society was done not by lone individuals. It was always done by groups of people. And I think that that legacy persists today, that we still run in groups, and we're probably still, when we run, we're still gossiping the way people were probably gossiping 2 million years ago. And I think it also helps explain why it is that running and runners raise so much money for charity, right? As I said before, something like there are more than hundreds of millions of dollars are raised every year by marathoners for charity. And I would argue this is a kind of transference, because back in the Stone Age, when we ran in order to help each other, right? We ran to hunt, to bring back animals, which we would share not just with our family, but with everybody in the group. We ran literally to help each other, and I think that instinct hasn't gone away. We still run to help each other, except we're not allowed to even kill the bison along the course. And nobody wants to run down animals very much anymore, but we still have that instinct, I believe, in order to run to help each other. If any of you get a chance to go to the finish line, you'll see some tired people, but you'll see mostly really, really, really happy people. And they're not just simply happy because they're not running anymore, although that is part of it. They're actually feeling really good. And most of people who do run long distances, once you get in shape and you learn the skill of running, it's quite remarkable how good it is. And if you're ever, sometimes many of you may have had this feeling, but you're running, you go out for a run, and maybe you're 7 or 8 miles in your run, and all of a sudden you realize, I just feel awesome. I feel so good. It's like an effortless thing. Your body is just flowing. And that phenomenon occurs partly because we actually have a huge number of adaptations that make us so good at it, right? We have all these features that make us superb runners. Shoulders that are low and wide and decoupled from our heads. Short arms, really big gluteus maximus, which, by the way, is a running muscle. It has nothing to do with walking. Long tendons in our Achilles, and no fur, and our muscle fiber types, and short toes, and the arches in our feet, and head balancing systems. We are filled with adaptations that actually give us the capability of running really well. And I think that helps give us this enormous sense. But there are also other adaptations which are chemical, right? How many of you have ever had a runner's high? It's great. The best thing about a runner's high is that not only do you produce lots of endocannabinoids, these same thing as from pot, but you also upregulate when you're running the receptors. So you're producing the chemical, but you're also enhancing the number of receptors that the chemical binds to. And anybody who's had a good runner's high knows that it's way better than anything you can smoke. And we have evidence that that system evolved in humans and is present in animals that do a lot of running, and not present in animals that don't do running. So I think the runner's high, which by the way is, endocannabinoids help improve sensory perception, may be an adaptation for us for when we were tracking and hunting, to improve our ability to monitor the world around us and see all those tracks and create mental maps and figure out what we're doing when we're running. Why does running make people so healthy? This is one of my favorite studies. There are many, many, many studies on the effects of exercise on health, but this is a local study. It's just from down the street, so I thought I'd show it today. And it's just on runners, and we're talking about running today. But this is the famous Stanford runners study started by Jim Fries in the 1980s. He took 538 runners. These were not elite runners and marathoners, et cetera, but members of the sort of Stanford, Palo Alto, whatever running club. And he's been following them ever since and compared them to a group of matched controls. These were not overweight people. They were not smokers. They were not drinkers. And he's been studying them ever since and looking at how their health has progressed, and not only measuring mortality, but also disability and morbidity. And you can see that this is from 2004, so this is 25 years into the study, that the runners at 20 years later, right, had 20% lower mortality rates than the non-runners. It's a huge difference, right? And the runners had bodies that were, on average, based on these disability measures, that were 14 years younger. They were basically aging at half the rate as the non-runners. And that, of course, there's a lot of interesting biology behind that. But it's not that running, I would say, or physical activity is a medicine that makes you healthy. I would argue it's the reverse, that the absence of physical activity is what makes people unhealthy. And we sometimes get that wrong. Our evolutionary history of runners also explains why we can do it barefoot, but that's another lecture. Here's Abibi Bakila, who set the world record in the Rome Olympics in 1960 barefoot. This is Ken Bob Saxon. We were talking about him earlier, running the San Francisco Marathon. I don't know how many marathons he's run barefoot. You can see he's wearing a beanie hat, so yes, he is a little bit odd. And lots of other people run barefoot. You can do it. There's been a lot of hullabaloo about it, but it's not actually that big a deal. And finally, I think that running can help us understand some human universals. I don't know if you know about human universals, but there's been a lot of efforts over the years to try to figure out what's common to all societies, right? So for example, all societies cook their food. We all have marriage. We all have mother-in-law jokes. We all have music. But it turns out that one human universal is that every culture in the world has underwear. We all have some form of sort of modesty accoutrements, right? And there's lots of different kinds, and some of them are more interesting than others. But I would argue that maybe this also has something to do with running, because when you run, you're creating substantial accelerations of your body, right? Running is actually jumping from one leg to another. That's basically what you're doing when you're running biomechanically. And of course, when you jump, you're accelerating your center of mass up, right? And then as you fall, your center of mass is accelerating downward, and you're going up and down and up and down and up and down, right? And all of you remember high school physics, right? Remember Newton's second law? For every action, there's an equal opposite reaction, right? So when this guy's body is accelerating downward, everything that's not tied down is going to accelerate up. And when he's accelerating up, everything that's not tied down, like his penis, is going to accelerate down. It happens with breasts too, right? Anything that's not tied down. And so I would argue that when we started running millions of years ago, and we have to run really long distances, all that jiggling and flapping was perhaps a little bit uncomfortable. And so we figured out how to tie things down. By the way, this is the oldest known underwear that's found from the archaeological record. It's from an Egyptian tomb. So the benefit of underwear is that it prevents some of that annoying jiggling. You can think about that on Sunday when you run, or when you watch the runners. But of course, everything has trade-offs. There are costs and benefits to everything. And the benefit may be less jiggling. The cost, of course, is chafing. And so you'll also see some things like this, too, on Sunday as well. So in short, I would like to argue that everything, nothing in biology, including jiggling penises and whatever, but nothing in biology, including the marathon, makes sense except in the light of evolution. And that running is part of what made us human, and that on Sunday when we watch all those folks out there, and those of you who are running, I hope you have a great time running, and that what we're not doing is anything strange or weird. Well, I mean, it's a little bit strange or weird, because nobody ever got on a line and ran 26.2 miles without stopping to another line. But beyond that, the basic act of running and the reason that we run actually hasn't changed all that much for over 2 million years. So for those of you who are running, good luck on Sunday. Thanks, and thanks to the Leakey Foundation. I look forward to taking some questions. So it's quiz time. All right, I'm a professor, so I don't normally do true and false or multiple choice questions, but you're going to get some multiple choice questions. Okay, so here we go. Everybody ready? How much more efficient are men than women at running? A, 0, well, you can read it yourself. 0, 5, or 10. So you know what efficiency is, right? Efficiency is how much, it's like miles per gallon, how much energy used per unit mass, per unit distance. That's what I'm just saying, how much energy you use per unit mass, per unit distance. So, so the answer is actually 0%, correct. It's an old myth. So women aren't as fast as men on average, right? Although there are plenty of women who are a lot faster than a lot of men. But actually, that old myth that, that wider hips make women less efficient at running or walking is completely untrue. And interestingly, if you go back in literature, the first equipment ever used to measure oxygen consumption during exercise, back from the 1920s, something called a Douglas bag. Actually, even back in the 1920s, we knew that women were no less efficient than men. And yet, this idea has pervaded our psyche for years. And yeah? Oh, it's very common. In fact, there's something called the obstetric dilemma. People argue that why don't women have wider hips, right? To give birth to bigger babies. And the argument has always been, that they don't have wider hips because if they had wider hips, it would cost them more for locomotion. And therefore, they couldn't have so therefore, women have problems giving birth to babies in order to save energy in order for locomotion. And there's a trade-off. Turns out that wider hips don't actually cause women to become more costly in locomotion, which raises an interesting question, which is why still don't they have wider hips? But it's not because of locomotion. And one possibility is that actually until recently, women didn't have such problems giving birth, that the obstetrics were less complicated until we started getting really, really big babies. But that's another lecture. Okay, back to so question number 2. What is the most economical speed for a trained runner? 7 minutes a mile, 8 minutes a mile, 9 minutes a mile, or they cost the same? The answer actually is A. So I had nothing to do with so it turns out that one of the really interesting things about running, for most animals, the cost of locomotion, so how much energy it costs to run, if you graph speed on the x-axis and cost on the y-axis, it's a U-shaped curve, just like for walking. So there's an optimal speed for walking, right? We all know that there's a speed at which it's best to walk, and if you walk slower or faster, you're spending more energy. And most animals, when they run, also have a U-shaped curve during running, right? There's ponies and dogs. There's a speed that they're most efficient at. But one of the fascinating things about humans is that if you run from here to Berkeley, I guess there's a bay in the way, but whatever. If you run from here to somewhere at a 6-minute mile or a 7-minute mile or an 8-minute mile, it'll cost you the same amount of energy to get there. And that's because humans have what we call a flat cost of transport. And does anybody know why we have a flat cost of transport? Actually, as a hint, let me guess you. Can you think of any other animal that might also have a flat cost of transport instead of a U-shaped? Kangaroos, yes, absolutely. It's because humans have incredible springs in our legs. So when we hit the ground, we store up all this elastic energy in our Achilles tendon and various other springs, and also our feet. And we get that energy back. And the faster you run, the harder you hit, but the more energy you save and that gets returned to you. And so human running is remarkable in that it has its cost is speed independent up until you start sprinting. When you start sprinting, then it gets more expensive again. Because when you're sprinting, you actually start increasing your stride frequency, and then you have to expend more energy to accelerate and decelerate your legs. So that's one of the cool things about running, and one of the things that makes the skill of running interesting is that you can actually speed up and not. So when people are running the marathon on Sunday, the folks who win the marathon or coming in at just a little over 2 hours, they're not spending any more energy to run the marathon than the people who take 4 hours or 5 hours. They're actually expending the same amount of energy. They're just running better. All right. Next question. How many miles a week does an average Tarahumara runner run? So many of you read the book Born to Run, popularized a lot of my research. The Tarahumara are these famous runners from Mexico, from the Sierra Tarahumara, and they're famous long-distance runners. So 0, 20, 40, and 60. We've collected data on this, by the way, so I actually know the answer. Oh, looks like the 60s have it. How many of you voted 0? You're correct. They don't train. They don't even. Well, actually, if I were to ask the question, how many miles do they actually run, it would also still be 0. People there don't run unless they have to. That's actually one of the things that's wrong about the book Born to Run. Born to Run makes you think that everybody there is running all the time. They only run when they need to, usually when they have races or ceremonies. But most of the time, they walk. Running is not something that people do except on rare occasion. It's actually one of the grievous errors of that book. OK. Is there one more question, or is that it? Oh, yes. Last question. Which generates more impact, collisional force when you hit the ground? When you land on your heel, what we call a rear foot strike or heel strike. When you land mid-foot, with both the front and the back of your foot hitting at the same time, or land on the ball of your foot. Or D, it depends on the shoe. Yeah, it is incorrect. Rear foot strike is correct answer. All right. So and just to very explain, basically the biomechanics is that when you land on your heel, there's a lot of collisional energy exchanged and exchange of momentum. So momentum is mass times velocity, right? And it has to be conserved. Remember, conservation of momentum. So when you land on your heel, pretty much your whole body from your knee down stops. And it stops pretty rapidly. And there's what we call an impact peak. You can hear it, right? When you hit the treadmill, there's a thud, right? But when you land on the ball of your foot, only your foot has stopped. Your ankle's still coming down, your knee is still flexing. So much less of your body stops, and you also land in a much more what we call compliant or less stiff position. So if I got you all to jump up now, right? You're welcome to do that, by the way. You'll all land on the ball of your foot, right? And you land quietly, right? If you were to land on your heel, which I do not recommend, you'd make a lot more noise, and you'd also hurt yourself. And that's because you're using all those joints in your body to dampen the forces when you land, and less mass is actually involved in that collision in the first place. So running is jumping from one leg to another, and when people are barefoot, it hurts to land on their heel. So most people, when they're barefoot, don't land on their heel. They land on the ball of their foot. And it's really the modern running shoe that allows people to land on their heel. And there's a huge debate about whether or not that is good or bad and all that sort of other stuff. That's another story. OK. So what we're going to do now is transition now to talk about running form. Because one of the things that I think is important about running is that although it's something that we have been doing for millions of years, I also believe that, also many of the things we've been doing for millions of years, like throwing, it's a skill. And that we have this idea in our culture that all you need to do is give somebody a pair of shoes and send them out running, and first of all, everybody can run, just like everybody can walk. But the more I study running in different parts of the world, and I've studied it on almost every continent in the world, and the more I talk to runners, indigenous runners, people who learn to run in various cultures, the more I hear from runners that they think it's a skill, something that you need to learn. And just like many skills, we learn by watching and imitating people who are really good at it. So in Kenya, for example, Kenyan runners will actually take turns being the leader, and then they'll follow and imitate the person in the front of the pack. Tarahumara do the same thing. Running is, as I said before, a social thing, but also a skill. And so one of the debates that's really going on now is what's the best way to run? And so as a way of discussing that, and as we thought it would be fun to get two people up here and running. And what we'll do is we'll get some on the treadmill. and we'll film them with the iPhone in slow motion, project their running on the screen, and we'll talk about their running form. So let's start with our first victim. Hey. What's your name? What's your name?
My name's Kathleen.
Kathleen, all right. So, and before we start, how much do you run? And
the last week, just twice, but whenever I can.
Okay, good. All right. So Ian will measure Kathleen, and we'll get her up to kind of moderate speed. And obviously, normally in the lab we get somebody running for a good 5-10 minutes, get them warmed up before we measured them.
All the whispers don't help.
You're doing great. You're doing great. 26.2 miles. Absolutely.
Only 11. It's not like 11:30.
5.2 miles per hour. All right. Are we Ian? What do you? Are we good? Should we put Kathleen out of her misery here? All right. Excellent.
Fine.
All right.
Very good.
So while you get that loaded,
Okay.
So there's obviously a lot to running form, but I would say that if you were to sort of poll, so I'm going to give what I would say is a consensus view rather than my own peculiar view, okay? So if you were to poll a lot of people who study running and ask them what are the key elements of running form that really matter in terms of performance, but also possibly injury, I think most people would agree on 4 components of running. The first is posture, especially how much you lean from the hip versus from the ankle. So everybody, when they run, you lean a little bit forward. But what you see a lot of runners out there when they're doing is when they lean at their hips, right? You all see that person running like that, right? When you do that, that actually creates big bending moments around your hip, right? There's a torque, because you think your upper body is sort of separate from your lower body and has a high center of mass. Every time you hit the ground, it wants to fall forward. And that's a high amount of angular momentum, right? The mass, if any of you remember the mass moment of inertia from high school physics, right? There's a lot of mass that's positioned very high up, and it's being accelerated around an axis around the hip, and that's creating a lot of force, and you have to then counteract that with your butt and your back. So leading a lot from your hip is actually a problem. So I think good running form involves good posture, and I think you had pretty good posture. A second component to running form is your stride frequency. So it turns out that how many times a minute you step, or let's call it your step frequency, turns out to be very important in terms of a number of things. One is economy. So almost all people have an optimal frequency. So I told you there's no optimal speed, but there is an optimal frequency for running. And for most people, it's about 170 to 180. Actually, 172 is the average, according to some studies that we've done. There's Kathleen running. So you actually were running at about 152, 153. So you're actually running inefficiently. And the other thing that happens when you have a very low stride frequency is that speed is stride rate, or step rate, times step length. Right? So when you have a low step rate or a low stride frequency, that means you have to take really long steps. When you take really long steps, that means you have to land with a very stiff leg. And that puts lots of forces around your knee, what we call high moments. So if I were you, one of the things I would do is I would increase your stride frequency and get up to maybe about 170. But that takes a little bit of practice. The third component of running is we're going to do posture, stride frequency, foot strike, and yeah, not yet. And there was one other one I was going to talk about. Well, anyway, so foot strike is the third one, right? So we already talked about the fact that there's rear foot strikes, mid foot strikes, and forefoot strikes. And Kathleen is clearly a forefoot striker. So she's landing on the ball of her foot, which for the kinds of shoes she's wearing is exactly what she should be doing, because you're wearing a minimal shoe that has no cushioning. So that's good. So you're landing on the ball of your foot. But there's a trade-off. So a lot of people who land what's a forefoot strike, it's a very gentle way of landing. But if you land that way, you have to have really strong calf muscles. And what happens is a lot of people, when they switch, for example, to barefoot running or minimal shoes, they they have a hard time doing that because they don't have the calf muscle strength, and they get calf muscle strains. And sometimes they get problems in their Achilles muscles, Achilles tendon. They get Achilles tendinopathies. But those you can actually train yourself through. You can adapt, strengthen your calf and strengthen your Achilles. And then the final thing, can we pause at the moment of impact? And the final thing I want to talk about is something called overstriding. So an overstride is when you land, and where you land with your foot. There's two ways of defining it. One is where you land with your foot relative to your, is it possible?
Try
There we go.
Okay.
That's pretty good. Can you advance like one frame? Is that a problem? Oh! That's not too bad.
Okay.
That's a little bit in, but we don't have the technology we use in the lab. But everybody lands with their foot in front of their hip, unless you're a world-class sprinter. If you watch Usain Bolt, when Usain Bolt lands, his foot is right underneath his hip. And if you think about it, for every action, there's an equal opposite reaction. So if you land with your foot out here, you're pressing against the ground in that direction. So the ground is going to press back against you in this direction. It's going to break you. It's going to slow you down. Now, if you're trying to win a 100-meter sprint, and the ground is pushing you backward, that's going to slow you down, and you're going to lose. So world-class sprinters have to land right underneath their body. So there's no deceleration. That takes enormous strength. You have to have really strong gluteus muscles and really strong hamstrings, and you just have to be really strong, which, of course, these great sprinters are. But the problem is that they store up much less elastic energy when they run that way. So that's not an endurance way of running. Endurance runners have to land out here. But one thing that they do, and Kathleen's pretty good at it, is that when you land, you have to land in front of your body, and there is some deceleration of your center of mass. But we've learned from various studies that the best way to land is with a vertical tibia. So you don't want to land like that or like that. You want to land like that. So your shank should be vertical. When you do that, you actually produce a lot less force around your knee, and you store up more energy, and there's less braking force. So I would say that Kathleen's a pretty darn good runner. And the only thing that, that might improve your economy a little bit is to increase your stride frequency. But beyond that, I'd say you're ready to run the marathon. Good.
I'm good with halves.
Good, excellent. Thank you so much.
Great meeting you.
All right. All right, who's next?
What's your name?
Amber.
Amber, okay. And one of the cool things about iPhones is that you can slow down. I mean, if anybody wants to get a gait analysis, you can now, anybody who has a decent phone can now do this. Get somebody to film you on a treadmill or when you're running outside. And there's some good websites out there. That's pretty fast. Now, one thing to notice about Amber, can you notice that she's making a lot more noise than Kathleen did? That's because she's heel striking. She's got more impact.
You want to keep going? We can stop.
I think we should stop. All right. So the first thing is, remember, we're talking about 4 different aspects of running form, right? Posture, cadence, overstride, and strike. So your cadence was totally different from Kathleen. So yours was about 172, actually. So you're running with a very high cadence, pretty much close to what most people predict is the average sort of optimum for most people. So that's good. Perfect cadence. Let's take a look at her posture. It was kind of harder to... I'd say it's pretty good posture. So excellent. So she's running really well. She's got no really serious leaning at the hips, which is really good. So that means that she's not losing energy with all that sort of tilt to her upper body. She's got excellent stride frequency, but you'll notice if we can freeze it at the moment of impact, Ian, I know this is a little challenging. The one thing, okay, there, perfect. Okay, so that is a classic heel strike and a classic overstride. See how Amber's tibia, right, her shank, hold on, we actually have we're gonna have one of these, right? Her shank is not vertical, Kathleen's shank was very vertical, but hers is angled out there. She's landing pretty hard on her heel, but fortunately she's got lots of cushioning in her shoe, which slows the rate of loading. Doesn't actually get rid of the energy, but it just slows the rate of loading of that energy. But we know from a bunch of studies that that kind of landing generates very high torques around the knee. You have lower torques around the ankle than the way that Kathleen was running, but there's always a trade-off, and that trade-off is in the knee. And some researchers, there's a big debate going on, but some researchers believe that this kind of landing, if you were doing a lot of running, 15 miles a week is not so much, so it's not a big deal. But if you were to go up to like 50 miles a week and run like this, you might, by some people's arguments, right, be much more at risk of shin splints and the.
Last year I broke my fibula, actually. Stress fractured my fibula running.
All right, so.
About 50 miles a week.
Okay, well, there you go. I didn't know any of this. We did not have any conversation beforehand, but that's typical of this kind of running form. It's very high impact, and we could all hear that because you're running in a way that really is a very stiff-legged form of locomotion, and if you were to get your knee up a bit more, right, by flexing your hip more and land with a more vertical tibia, you don't have to necessarily lose the heel strike. If you want to still be a heel striker, that's okay. But if you land with a somewhat flatter foot and a more vertical tibia, you would decrease the amount of force that you hit the ground with, the impact, decrease the amount of torque around your knee, and that might actually help with that. And I would say that's of all the things that you're doing in your running, because the overstride and the heel strike are very linked. So by some people's arguments about running, and I have to say that nobody agrees on any of this sort of stuff completely, and so I don't want to be too prescriptive, but your injury does fit the pattern, which is that you're overstriding and heel striking, and that can be tough when you're doing you have a lot of impacts. Other than that, awesome. Good, thank you.